Well, the first wattle of the year, first few days in May, we may as well talk about Reconciliation Week. Well, it's appropriate as this is the first wattle of the year, and wattle is Australia's national flower, that we look at the concept of Reconciliation Week and what led up to it, and how it's a week that has become a divisive part of Australian life. Now, Reconciliation Week is bookended by National Sorry Day, which this year occurs on the 26th of May, and Mabo Day, which occurs on Wednesday the 3rd of June. So what are these 2 days? National Sorry Day came out of the Bringing Them Home Royal Commission, which looked at the removal of Indigenous children from their parents, a removal which in a significant number of cases was not based on a standard of living, but on a policy of assimilation. Mabo Day, the 3rd of June, marks the day on the 3rd of June 1992 when the High Court of Australia found that First Nations people had rights to land in law. And the concept of terra nullius, the empty land, the legal fiction which Australia was based on, was overturned. So these are the 2 days which bookend Reconciliation Week. Reconciliation Week came out of an endeavour by local groups to overcome the continuing divisions which exist between First Nations people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and the rest of us, whether we were born here, whether we're migrants, whether we're refugees or asylum seekers. Australia has quite a checkered history as far as reconciliation is concerned. Let's not forget when the east coast of Australia was claimed by Captain Cook for the British Empire in 1770, that over 1 million First Nations people lived on this continent in over 250 distinct groups who had distinct areas of land they were responsible for, and who had lived here for over 65,000 years, and who continue to be the longest continuous living culture on planet Earth. Even the cave paintings which you find in Europe are dated around 30,000 years ago, while the rock carvings which are found in the Western Australia can be dated for up to 50,000 years. So here we find ourselves in this situation. I think it's important that we look at the history, because unfortunately the history of denial is part and parcel of everyday life, not just amongst the population as a whole, but those who exercise power on our behalf. Whether it's the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, or whether it's our political representatives in the state and federal parliaments. Now, the initial settlement at Port Jackson in 1788 was carried out by the British Empire to offload its burgeoning number of convicts, many living on hulks in the Thames for economic crimes. And so, with the loss of the American colonies in 1776, there was no place by which to send people. So I was sent to the end, what was described as the ends of the earth. Now the interaction between the original colonisers and the First Nation people, although relatively friendly in the first year or so, degenerated into a war of attrition. A war which continued until the mid-1920s, when the last massacres occurred in West Australia. Now these are facts. But the trouble is, facts, as far as our origin story is concerned as a nation, are in short supply. And they continue to be ignored, pushed aside, and most importantly of all, denied. And nothing highlighted this more than the tragedy of the failure of the Voice to Parliament referendum, which occurred about two to 3 years ago, where the Australian people, in significant numbers, decided they didn't want First Nations people to have a voice to Parliament. Not representation in Parliament, but a voice in terms of giving their opinions when legislation was passed by First Nations people. Now this defeat was a combination of First Nations people themselves, in its minority of cases, arguing against the voice, some for conservative reasons, others for what they believed were questions of sovereignty. But the fact is that wherever you look in this country, when you look at the legislation and the policies and the way colonisation occurred, and more importantly its existing legacy, that we as a people tend to look away. And when reconciliation is possible, or begins to be a reality, what we see is people in positions of authority denying the past. Let's not forget that the great cattle stations of the north were built on unpaid Aboriginal labour and Torres Strait Islander labour. That it wasn't until 1966 that these workers were paid. Before that, and I'm talking about 1966, before that they were paid with blankets, flour, tobacco, sugar. Women were sexually abused on a regular basis, and we saw a large number of children being born whose parentage was denied by the people responsible, but who were looked after mainly by their mothers and by the groups, the Indigenous clans and groups, which they were part of. Now the 19th century, and I'm not going to go through this, you're well aware of this, was a century of continuing displacement, continuing colonisation in its most brutal manner. And we saw over and over and over again that those responsible for the brutality never found themselves in court, and if they found themselves in court, their charges would be dismissed. But one of the main exceptions was the Mile Creek Massacre in, I think, 1836, where the convicts who were involved in the massacre were hung, but the very squatters who organised the massacre were not even questioned. So we have this checkered history. By the beginning of the 20th century, it was believed that Indigenous Australians were a dying race, and all we could do was smooth the pillow of a dying race. And let's not forget that in Tasmania, something happened in Tasmania that has hardly happened anywhere else in the world. A whole people were almost driven to extinction. So I'm not talking about this to make you feel guilty. Guilt has no part in Reconciliation Week. There is no ability of guilt to be used as a strategy to bridge the continuing gap that exists. Now, unfortunately in this country, when it federated, not only were Indigenous people not incorporated in the Australian Constitution, they were expressively excluded. But what we saw is policies being introduced by state governments which were based on the idea of assimilating those children of mixed heritage, whether they were European or Asiatic, into the Australian mainstream. And the way that that was done was through brutal policies which were introduced by state governments, because the federal government, which occurred on the 1st of January 1901, had no legislative power to legislate in terms of First Nations people. So we saw legislation being enacted around Australia, especially in areas where there was a significant Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, which basically treated them little more than slaves. In the 20s and 30s and 40s, you couldn't move without permission. If you were lucky enough to receive a small wage, that wage was kept by the state authorities. So we had these incredible pieces of repressive legislation. It's interesting. They were based on the concept of separate development. It was interesting that the South African authorities came to look at the situation in Queensland, which allowed them to shape their apartheid policies in South Africa. The difference was, in South Africa, the black population was a majority. In Queensland, it was a minority. But the same laws, the same philosophy governed the way the apartheid system was created. Because what we had is something which was worse than apartheid. At least in apartheid, it's the idea of separate development. Here, it was about assimilation, smoothing the pillow of a dying race. And what we saw was an introduction of a policy which allowed thousands, if not tens of thousands, of mixed race children who were mainly cared for by their mothers to be removed. Not one child, not two children, but thousands to be removed and placed in what were little more than concentration camps, where they were educated to a level where they could be used as cheap labour, and in the case of the girls, as domestic servants. It wasn't until 1992. That's right, 1992. Over 200 years since colonisation began. The legal fiction that this country was based on, terra nullius, the land of no one, the legal fiction which allowed the brutalisation, the colonisation, the massacres, displacement to occur, was overturned not by Parliament, but by the High Court of Australia, where Eddie Mabo, grandfather Rice, another litigant, spent 10 years going through the courts. Unfortunately for Eddie Mabo, the litigant from Mur in the Torres Strait, he died before the decision was handed down. As I said, we have had important victories, but mainly it's been losses. And that big victory began in 1967, when the people of this country, over 90%, voted in a referendum to give the federal parliament the power to legislate for First Nations people. It's not a matter of them being counted in a referendum, as everybody speaks about. It's about a federal parliament have power. And we saw the Whitlam-led Labor government use this power to begin the land rights movement. You would think that the 1992 Mabo High Court decision would cause celebration in this country, but what it did, it caused disinformation, increasing hatred. And if it wasn't for Keating, Prime Minister Keating in the Redfern speech, who outlined the atrocities that occurred, most Australians would have no idea. But there was a fight back. And that fight back was from those people who had acquired that land through the colonisation process, who believed the power they were able to exercise and the land they owned was under threat. And what we saw was bucket loads of extinguishment being passed to federal parliament in order to water down the Mabo High Court decision. And many of the negatives which surround land rights today are not because of the Mabo decision, are because of the legislation which was passed to try to nullify any positive impact of the Mabo decision. So we have this checkered history. But what's even more extraordinary is how the Howard government, a Liberal National Party during its tenure, attempted to deny the facts of the colonisation process. And what is even more extraordinary in 2026, we have an increasing movement in this country which has been aided and abetted by political parties like Divided Nation and the Liberal Party and the National Party, which are doing everything they can to destroy any attempts, no matter how small, regarding reconciliation. We see powerful forces in this country denying the past, falsifying the present, making false claims, increasing hatred in the community, and they are being rewarded. They are being rewarded by an increasing number of my fellow citizens voting for them at state and federal elections. We have the ridiculous situation in the state of Victoria, which took 5 years to organise a treaty with Victoria's First Nations people, where the Victorian opposition, which may become the next government in Victoria, has a policy of ripping up that treaty. See, the difference between First Nations people wanting a voice to Parliament and the Victorian Treaty is that a voice to Parliament could only occur for a referendum, and only a referendum could take away that voice. As far as a state-based treaty is concerned, or a federal treaty is concerned, if it's not incorporated in the Australian Constitution any government at any time can tear up that treaty, irrespective of what the previous government promised. So Reconciliation Week, although it's been pushed aside, although it's bookended by two of the most important days in this country's history, National Sorry Day and Mabo Day, is still a significant part of our history. We use Reconciliation Week to take those first steps in that long battle, that long struggle to overcome differences which have been created by a colonisation process which was based on the idea that although over 1 million people lived on this continent, that no one lived on this continent during colonisation. I encourage you, in your local area, there will be reconciliation ceremonies. There will be people who continue to attempt to bridge that gap. Not a gap based on physical differences, but a gap which is entrenched in ideological differences. So I encourage you to participate during Reconciliation Week in activities that promote the idea that we need to reconcile. Without reconciliation, there is no step forward. There are no enduring treaties. There are no apologies. The ball is in your court. Reconciliation Week is almost upon us. Have a look at what's happening in your local area. Join that ceremony. It doesn't matter if there's one of us, or 3 of us, or 15 of us, or 500,000. The fact is, as long as 2 of us, one from either side, remember the importance of this week, that it will continue to exist and grow in the future.